Thunder had hospitalized 2 trainers and attacked everyone within 10 feet, earning a death sentence from the insurance company in 72 hours. When the veteran whispered a single word through the fence, the killer stallion began to tremble like a man remembering war. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust cloud rose from the ranch yard like a warning signal, visible from half a mile down the road. Inside the corral, chaos reigned. A massive white stallion, standing nearly 18 hands high, reared up on his hind legs with such force that the ground trembled beneath him. His eyes were wild, rolling back to show the whites, and foam dripped from his mouth as he let out a scream that sent shivers down the spine of every person who heard it. 3 ranch hands scrambled over the fence rails, barely escaping the powerful hooves that came crashing down where they had stood moments before. This was Thunder, and Thunder was a problem that nobody seemed able to solve. The horse had arrived at Meadowbrook Ranch just 2 weeks earlier, purchased at auction by the owner, Marcus Webb, who had been assured the animal was simply spirited and needed an experienced hand. What Marcus got instead was a 1,500-pound weapon that attacked anyone who came within 10 feet of him. Already, Thunder had sent 2 trainers to the hospital, kicked a hole through the stable wall, and destroyed 3 halters. The veterinarian who examined him remotely, unwilling to get close enough for a proper check, could find no physical cause for the aggression. Thunder was healthy, well-fed, and utterly untouchable. Marcus stood outside the corral now, his weathered face creased with frustration and worry. He was a 4th-generation rancher, a man who had worked with horses his entire life, and he had never encountered anything like this. The stallion paced along the fence line, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his gleaming white coat. His nostrils flared as he searched for any threat, any target for his rage. Marcus had tried everything he knew: soft approaches, firm handling, giving the horse space, bringing in specialists. Nothing worked. Thunder seemed to exist in a state of perpetual fury, as if the entire world had wronged him and he would make everyone pay. The ranch hands kept their distance, speaking in low voices about what should be done with the animal. Some said he should be put down before someone got killed. Others suggested selling him to someone foolish enough to take the risk, though Marcus knew that would just pass the problem along and likely end with the horse being destroyed anyway. A few of the older cowboys shook their heads and muttered that some horses were just born mean, that Thunder had a black heart that no amount of patience or skill could ever reach. Marcus wanted to believe there was another explanation, some key to unlocking whatever prison Thunder's mind had created, but with each passing day, his hope dimmed. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah Chen, Marcus's ranch manager, approached with a clipboard and an expression that told him she had more bad news. Sarah was practical to her core, a woman who dealt in facts and solutions, and right now the facts about Thunder painted a grim picture. She stopped beside Marcus at a safe distance from the corral and sighed deeply before speaking. The insurance company had called that morning. They were threatening to drop coverage for the entire ranch if Thunder remained on the property. The liability was too high, they said. One more incident, one more injury, and Meadowbrook Ranch would be finished. Sarah looked at Marcus with sympathy in her dark eyes, but her words were firm. They had 72 hours to find a solution, or Thunder would have to go. Marcus felt the weight of that ultimatum settle on his shoulders. This ranch had been in his family for over a century. His great-grandfather had built the main barn with his own hands. His father had taught him to ride in these very corrals. Every fence post, every water trough, every blade of grass held a memory. He could not let it all be destroyed because of one troubled horse, no matter how much it pained him to admit defeat. Yet something in him resisted the easy answer. Thunder's aggression felt different from simple meanness. There was something almost desperate in the way the stallion fought, as if he was not attacking but defending himself from some invisible enemy. That afternoon, Marcus sat in his office, the air conditioning barely making a dent in the Texas heat, and scrolled through his phone looking for options. He had called every horse rescue within 300 miles. None would take an aggressive stallion. He had reached out to trainers specializing in difficult animals. They either wanted astronomical fees he could not afford, or outright refused after hearing Thunder's history. The auction house where he had purchased the horse had washed their hands of the situation, pointing to the as-is clause in the sale contract. Marcus was running out of time and options, watching the hours tick away toward a decision he desperately did not want to make. It was Sarah who brought him the newspaper clipping. She had found it pinned to the bulletin board at the feed store in town, yellowed and curled at the edges but still readable. The notice was simple. James Mitchell, Army veteran with experience in equine therapy, available for horse training and rehabilitation. Specializes in traumatized and aggressive animals. Below that was a phone number and an address on the outskirts of town. Sarah placed the clipping on Marcus's desk without a word, but her meaning was clear. This was the last chance, the final card to play before the game ended. Marcus stared at the paper for a long moment, then reached for his phone. What did he have to lose? James Mitchell lived in a small cabin at the end of a dirt road that most people in town had forgotten existed. The property was simple, almost sparse, with a weathered fence line and a modest stable that housed 2 older horses who grazed peacefully in the morning light. At 43 years old, James carried himself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to waste neither movement nor words. His hair was cut military short, gray creeping in at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of hard work and the scars of harder memories. He had returned from his 3rd deployment 5 years ago, bringing with him wounds that no doctor could see and no medicine could heal. The nightmares had been the worst part at first. James would wake in the darkness, his heart hammering, sweat soaking through his sheets, convinced he was back in the desert with the sound of explosions ringing in his ears. He had tried the medications the VA prescribed, sat through the therapy sessions, filled out the endless forms, but nothing seemed to reach the place inside him where the war still lived. It was not until a friend suggested he try working with horses that James found something resembling peace. There was something about the animals, their honesty, their inability to lie or pretend, that spoke to him in ways human conversation never could. He started volunteering at a therapeutic riding center, helping veterans like himself reconnect with the world through equine therapy. James discovered he had a gift for reading horses, for understanding the subtle language of their movements and expressions. More importantly, he found he could reach the difficult ones, the horses that had been abused or traumatized, the ones that everyone else had given up on. These animals recognized something in him, perhaps sensing that he too carried invisible wounds. In their rehabilitation, James found his own healing, and over time, word spread about the quiet veteran who could gentle the most troubled horses. When his phone rang that afternoon, James was in the stable brushing down Maggie, a 20-year-old mare he had rescued from a neglect situation 2 years prior. The number was unfamiliar, and he almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Marcus Webb's voice came through, tense and rushed, explaining the situation with Thunder. James listened without interrupting, his trained ear picking up the desperation beneath the ranch owner's professional tone. Marcus spoke of the stallion's aggression, the failed attempts to work with him, the ticking clock of the insurance deadline. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. James stood there in the stable, phone pressed to his ear, considering. He had worked with aggressive horses before, but something about the description Marcus gave him triggered a familiar recognition. The unprovoked attacks, the constant state of hypervigilance, the inability to trust any human presence. These were not the behaviors of a mean horse. These were the behaviors of a terrified one. James had seen the same patterns in soldiers returning from combat, the way trauma could rewire the brain to see threats everywhere, to react with violence before reason had a chance to intervene. If he was right, if Thunder's aggression came from fear rather than malice, then maybe there was hope. He told Marcus he would come take a look, but he made no promises. James had learned not to commit to outcomes he could not control. Some horses could be helped and some were too far gone, their trauma so deep that the kindest option was to let them go peacefully. He would not know which category Thunder fell into until he met the animal himself. Marcus gave him the address and asked when he could come. James glanced at his watch and said he would be there within the hour. After hanging up, he stood for a moment longer in the stable, running his hand along Maggie's neck, gathering his thoughts and his courage for what lay ahead. The drive to Meadowbrook Ranch took James through familiar countryside, past fields where cattle grazed and farmhouses with American flags hanging from their porches. He had grown up not far from here, had learned to ride before he learned to read, spent his childhood summers working on his uncle's ranch. The army had taken him away from all that, had shown him parts of the world he wished he could forget, and when he came back, he found he could no longer fit into the life he had left behind. The horses had given him a bridge back, a way to reconnect with the land and the work that had once defined him. As he pulled into the ranch entrance, James could see the main house in the distance, a sprawling structure that spoke of generations of successful ranching. The corrals and barns were well maintained, the fences straight and strong. This was a professional operation, not some backyard hobby farm. Marcus Webb met him in the driveway, climbing out of a dusty pickup truck with a handshake that was firm but weary. The ranch owner looked like he had not slept well in days, his eyes shadowed with worry. James recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror often enough during his worst times. Marcus wasted no time with small talk, leading James toward the isolated corral where Thunder was kept separate from the other horses. As they walked, Marcus filled in more details about the stallion's history, or rather, the lack of it. The auction house had provided minimal information. Thunder had apparently been seized from a property out west, part of an animal welfare case that involved dozens of horses in various states of neglect. The authorities had rounded up the animals and sold them off quickly to free up space and resources. Thunder's paperwork listed him as approximately 7 years old, breed unknown, temperament questionable. That was all anyone knew about him. No training records, no medical history beyond a basic vet check, no information about what his life had been like before he entered the system. He was a ghost horse, Marcus said, appearing out of nowhere with no past and possibly no future. As they approached the corral, James could see the stallion in the distance. Even from 100 yards away, Thunder's presence was undeniable. The horse stood perfectly still in the center of the enclosure, his white coat almost luminous in the afternoon sun, his head held high as he tracked their approach. There was something regal about his bearing despite the violence that reportedly simmered beneath the surface. James had seen this before in both horses and men, the way trauma could create a fortress around the soul, turning victims into warriors who struck first and asked questions never. Sarah Chen joined them at the fence line, introducing herself with a handshake and a warning. She had been the one to pull Thunder's last trainer out of the corral after the stallion had charged him, and she wanted James to understand the severity of the situation. This was not a horse that could be approached casually. Thunder had put a man in the hospital with broken ribs and a concussion. Another trainer had required stitches after the horse caught him with a glancing blow from a hoof. Sarah's voice was firm but not unkind, as she explained that if James wanted to work with Thunder, he would be doing so entirely at his own risk. The ranch could not be held liable for anything that happened. James listened to all of this without taking his eyes off the stallion. Thunder had begun to move now, pacing along the far fence line with deliberate steps, his muscles coiled and ready. Every few seconds, the horse would stop and stare directly at the three humans watching him, ears pinned flat against his head, nostrils flaring. The message was clear. Stay away. Come closer and suffer the consequences. But James saw something else in those dark eyes, something the others might have missed, because they were too focused on the threat. He saw fear, not the skittish nervousness of a prey animal startled by sudden movement, but the deep bone-level terror of a creature that had learned the world was full of pain. Marcus asked if James wanted to go into the corral, perhaps try to establish some initial contact, but James shook his head. Not yet. He needed to watch, to observe, to let Thunder grow accustomed to his presence from a safe distance. Rushing in would only confirm whatever terrible lessons the horse had already learned about humans. Instead, James asked if he could have a chair brought out, and if Marcus would mind him spending some time just sitting near the fence. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, clearly puzzled by this request, but they agreed. Within minutes, one of the ranch hands had carried out an old folding chair and set it up about 15 feet from the corral. James settled into the chair, angling it so he was not facing Thunder directly. In horse language, direct eye contact was a challenge, a confrontation. He wanted to present himself as neutral, unthreatening, barely worthy of notice. For the first 20 minutes, James simply sat there, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow and steady. He did not look at Thunder, did not speak, did not move, except to shift his weight occasionally. This was a skill he had learned in the military, the ability to be still, to become part of the landscape rather than a target. It was also a technique he used with traumatized horses, giving them space to make their own observations without pressure. Thunder continued his pacing, but James noticed the pattern beginning to change. At first, the stallion had kept to the far side of the corral, as distant from the humans as the fence line allowed. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, Thunder's path began to curve slightly closer. The horse would never admit to curiosity, his body language still screaming aggression and warning, but something about James's stillness seemed to intrigue him. Here was a human who was not trying to catch him, train him, fix him, or hurt him. Here was someone who simply existed in the same space, asking nothing, demanding nothing. An hour passed, then 2. Marcus checked on James periodically, offering water and asking if he needed anything, but James waved him off with a small gesture. He was working now, though to anyone watching it looked like he was doing absolutely nothing. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening across the dusty ground. Ranch hands finished their duties and headed home for the day. Sarah returned to the office to handle paperwork. Still James sat, and still Thunder paced, the distance between them shrinking by inches that might as well have been miles. As the afternoon faded toward evening, something shifted. Thunder had worked his way around the corral until he was on the same side as James, perhaps 30 feet away. The stallion stopped his pacing and stood there, sides heaving slightly from the constant movement, his gaze fixed on the motionless man in the chair. James felt the weight of Thunder's stare but resisted the urge to look back. This was a critical moment, one that could either open a door or slam it shut forever. In his peripheral vision, he could see the horse's ears, no longer pinned flat but swiveling forward and back, processing information, trying to make sense of this strange human who broke all the rules Thunder had learned to expect. Most people approached with confidence or fear, with determination or hesitation, but always with intention. James offered none of that. He was simply present, a fact rather than a force, and this confused the stallion in a way that created a tiny crack in his armor. The evening air grew cooler, bringing with it the scent of hay from the barn and the distant sound of other horses settling in for the night. James allowed himself to take a deeper breath, letting his shoulders drop even further, showing Thunder through body language alone that there was no threat here, no agenda, no trap waiting to spring. The stallion took a single step forward, then froze, as if surprised by his own action. James remained motionless. Another step, then another. Thunder was now 20 feet away, close enough that James could hear the rhythm of his breathing, could see the tension in every muscle of that powerful body. Marcus had returned to watch from the house porch, binoculars in hand, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. In 2 weeks, Thunder had not allowed anyone within 30 feet without launching an attack. Now the stallion was voluntarily closing the distance, drawn by something in this quiet veteran that even Marcus could not quite understand. Sarah stood beside him, equally amazed, her practical mind struggling to reconcile the data of Thunder's previous behavior with the scene unfolding before them. She had been ready to tell James this was hopeless, that he was wasting his time, but now she held her tongue and simply watched. Thunder stopped at 15 feet, his body coiled like a spring. This was the danger zone, the distance where the previous attacks had occurred. James could feel the electricity in the air, the potential for violence hovering like a storm about to break. His military training kicked in, his senses heightened, calculating distances and escape routes without conscious thought. But he kept his body language unchanged, kept his breathing steady, kept his presence soft. He was telling Thunder a story without words, a story that said some humans could be safe, some spaces could be peaceful, some moments did not have to end in pain. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Thunder stood frozen in that killing distance, every instinct screaming at him to attack, to drive away this threat before it could hurt him. But James was not behaving like a threat. There was no aggression in his posture, no tension that signaled incoming violence. The stallion's nostrils flared as he drew in James's scent, processing layers of information that his prey animal brain was designed to interpret. He smelled the other horses on James's clothes, the honest sweat of physical work, the absence of fear chemicals that usually accompanied human nervousness. Most importantly, he smelled something that resonated with his own trauma, a signature of pain survived that created an unexpected bridge between man and beast. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Thunder did something that made Marcus actually gasp from the porch. The stallion lowered his head slightly, just a few inches, breaking the aggressive posture he had maintained since arriving at the ranch. It was not submission, not yet trust, but it was a question. The horse was asking if maybe, just maybe, this human might be different from the others. James felt his heart rate increase despite his outward calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the first sign that Thunder's fortress had a gate that might eventually open. Very slowly, moving with such gradual precision that the motion was almost invisible, James turned his head slightly toward Thunder. Not a direct stare, but an acknowledgement. He let the horse see his profile, the lines of his face, the gray in his hair, the scar along his jawline from a piece of shrapnel that had come too close in a firefight years ago. James knew he looked tired, weathered by more than just age, and perhaps that was what Thunder needed to see. Not strength or dominance, but survival. Evidence that life could wound you deeply and you could still continue, still show up, still try. Thunder's ears flicked forward completely now, a sign of genuine curiosity. The stallion took another step, then one more, until he stood just 10 feet from where James sat. At this distance, James could see the details of Thunder's face, the small scars hidden beneath the white coat, the way the horse's eyes were ringed with tension, the slight trembling in his legs that spoke of exhaustion from maintaining constant vigilance. This was not a monster. This was a survivor, just like James himself, just trying to make it through each day without being destroyed by the memories of what had come before. The light was fading fast now, the ranch settling into the purple twilight of a Texas evening. James knew he should probably call it a day, but something told him to stay just a little longer. Thunder was processing, working through years of learned terror, trying to reconcile what he knew about humans with what he was experiencing in this moment. It was too important to interrupt. The ranch had gone quiet except for the gentle sounds of evening settling in. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied softly and another answered. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the promise of cooler night air. Thunder's tail swished once, twice, not in agitation, but in something closer to contemplation. The stallion shifted his weight from one hoof to another, a small movement that nonetheless represented a significant change. For the first time since arriving at Meadowbrook Ranch, Thunder was allowing himself to relax, even if only by the smallest degree, in the presence of a human being. James understood that what was happening between them was a conversation, even though no words had been spoken. Every movement, every breath, every moment of stillness was communication. Thunder was telling him about betrayal and pain, about hands that had hurt and voices that had screamed. James was answering with patience and respect, with the kind of understanding that could only come from having walked through his own fire. They were two damaged souls recognizing each other across the species divide, acknowledging that survival sometimes meant building walls so high that even kindness looked like an attack. Marcus had gone inside to start dinner, but Sarah remained on the porch wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill, unwilling to miss whatever might happen next. She had worked with horses her entire adult life, had a degree in equine management and years of practical experience, but what she was witnessing defied everything she thought she knew. The aggressive stallion that had terrorized the ranch for 2 weeks was standing calmly near a man he had met only hours ago, and the man had not even entered the corral yet. It made no logical sense, and yet the evidence was right there in front of her. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, James made a decision. Very carefully, he shifted his position in the chair, angling his body more toward Thunder, while keeping his gaze soft and indirect. The stallion's muscles tensed immediately, ears swiveling back, ready to flee or fight. James froze, giving Thunder time to assess the change, to understand that this new position brought no new threat. Seconds ticked by, measured in heartbeats and held breaths. Gradually, Thunder's tension eased again, and James allowed himself to continue the slow turn until he was facing the horse more fully. Now came the truly risky part. James had been silent for nearly 3 hours, understanding that words could be weapons to a traumatized animal, that human voices might trigger memories Thunder was desperate to escape. But at some point, if they were going to move forward, James needed to speak. The question was timing and tone and trusting his instincts about when Thunder might be ready to hear a human voice without interpreting it as a prelude to violence. James took a slow breath, centering himself, finding that calm place inside that he had cultivated through years of meditation and therapy. Then, barely louder than a whisper, James spoke. His voice was low and gentle, rough around the edges from years of shouting orders in combat zones, but softened now with intention and care. He said just one word, simple and honest, directed at the horse who stood watching him in the gathering darkness. Easy, that was all. Just easy, spoken like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a story that might have a different ending than the ones Thunder had learned to expect. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Thunder's entire body went rigid, every muscle locking in place as if the word had struck him like a physical blow. His head shot up, ears pinned flat, eyes wide with something that looked like shock mixed with recognition. For a terrible moment, James thought he had miscalculated, that the stallion would explode into violence or panic. His hand moved subtly toward the chair's armrest, ready to vault himself backward if Thunder charged. But the attack never came. Instead, something even more unexpected happened. Thunder began to tremble, his powerful body shaking as if he was suddenly cold, though the evening was mild. The stallion's legs locked to keep him upright, but James could see the tremors running through him like earthquake aftershocks. The horse was not preparing to attack. He was remembering. James could see it in Thunder's eyes, the way they had gone distant and haunted, looking at something far beyond the corral. beyond the ranch, beyond the present moment entirely. Someone, somewhere in Thunder's past, had used that word. Easy. Perhaps it had been said by a trainer who actually cared, or maybe by someone in that moment before everything went wrong. Whatever the association, James's voice had unlocked something in Thunder's memory, had reached past the trauma to touch a place that the horse had thought was safely buried. Sarah stood up on the porch, alarmed by Thunder's reaction, ready to call out a warning to James. But James raised one hand slightly, a gesture that told her to wait, to trust, to let this moment unfold. He kept his eyes on Thunder, his voice soft as he spoke again, repeating that single word like a mantra. Easy, boy. Easy now. You're safe. I know you don't believe that yet, but you're safe. Each word was carefully chosen, delivered with the kind of gentle firmness that James had learned in his work with traumatized veterans, the tone that said, I see your pain and I'm not afraid of it. I'm not going anywhere. You can fall apart here, and I'll help you put the pieces back together. Thunder's trembling intensified for a moment, his breath coming in sharp snorts that sent puffs of mist into the cooling air. The stallion's eyes were wet, something James had seen before in horses experiencing emotional release, though most people did not realize horses could cry in their own way. Whatever Thunder was remembering, whatever door James's voice had opened, it was overwhelming the defenses the horse had built so carefully. This was the crisis point, the moment when trauma either broke free and began to heal or hardened into something permanent and unchangeable. James knew it intimately from his own journey through the darkness that followed war. Very slowly, James stood up from the chair. The movement was calculated, deliberate, giving Thunder every opportunity to process what was happening and make his own choice about how to respond. The stallion's head swung toward him, tracking the change in height, in threat profile, in the dynamic between them. James kept his hands visible and loose at his sides, his posture open and unthreatening. He took one small step toward the fence, then stopped, giving Thunder space to adjust. The horse did not bolt or charge. He simply stood there, shaking, watching, caught between the impulse to run and something else, something that might have been hope if hope was a thing Thunder still allowed himself to feel. James spoke again, his voice carrying clearly through the evening stillness. I know what it's like, he said, talking to Thunder as if the horse could understand every word, and perhaps on some level he could. I know what it's like to be so afraid that you hurt everyone who tries to help you. I know what it's like to wake up swinging, to see enemies everywhere, to believe that the only way to survive is to make sure nothing and no one gets close enough to hurt you again. James paused, his own memories rising up, the faces of friends who had tried to reach him in those early days after his return, the therapists he had pushed away, the family members who had eventually stopped calling because his anger and isolation were too painful to witness. Thunder's ears rotated forward, listening. The trembling had not stopped, but something about James's words, or perhaps the emotion beneath them, seemed to be reaching the stallion in a way that physical approach never could. James continued speaking, his voice steady despite the tightness in his own chest. Whatever happened to you, whatever made you this way, it wasn't your fault. You were trying to survive. You did what you had to do. But you're not in that place anymore, Thunder. You're here now, and here can be different if you let it be. The words were as much for James himself as for the horse, a reminder that healing was possible, even when it seemed impossible, that the past did not have to dictate the future forever. Marcus had come back out onto the porch, drawn by the sound of James's voice, and now stood beside Sarah, watching the scene unfold. Neither of them spoke, sensing that what was happening between the veteran and the stallion was sacred in its own way, a communion of wounded spirits that outsiders could observe but not truly participate in. Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat as he listened to James talk to Thunder, recognizing in those words the voice of someone who had walked through the valley of death and somehow found their way back to the land of the living. He began to understand why the newspaper clipping had called James a specialist in traumatized animals. The man was not just a trainer. He was a translator, someone who could speak the language of pain fluently enough to offer directions towards something better. The stars were fully visible now, scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet, and the ranch had settled into the quiet rhythms of night. James took another small step forward, closing the distance to the fence. He rested his forearms on the top rail, his body language relaxed and non-threatening, and continued talking to Thunder in that same low, steady voice. "You know what I learned, Thunder? I learned that the bravest thing you can do is let someone help you. It's easy to fight. Fighting is what we know. Fighting is how we survived. But trusting, letting down your guard even a little bit, that takes real courage. That's the kind of strength that actually matters in the end." Thunder took a tentative step toward James, then another. The stallion was now less than 8 feet away, well within striking distance if he chose violence. But instead of attacking, Thunder stretched his neck forward, his nostrils flaring as he drew in James's scent more fully. This was reconnaissance, information gathering, the horse trying to reconcile what his instincts told him about this human with what his experience had taught him about all humans. James remained perfectly still, letting Thunder take his time, letting the horse make all the decisions about proximity and pace. This was Thunder's journey, and James was just offering to walk beside him if the stallion would allow it. The moment stretched between them, laden with possibility. Then Thunder did something that made Sarah gasp softly from the porch. The stallion took one more step and gently, carefully touched his nose to James's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only a second before Thunder jerked his head back, startled by his own boldness, by the vulnerability he had just shown. But it was enough. In that brief touch, James felt the warmth of Thunder's breath, the softness of his muzzle, the faint trembling that still ran through the horse's body. More importantly, he felt the barrier beginning to crack, the fortress walls developing their first hairline fracture. James did not move, did not reach out to try and maintain the contact. He simply stood there with his hand in the same position, palm up, offering rather than demanding, waiting for Thunder to decide if he was brave enough to try again. The ranch hands who had gathered quietly behind the main barn, drawn by word spreading through the property that something extraordinary was happening, watched in stunned silence. These were men and women who worked with horses every day of their lives, who prided themselves on their skill and experience, and not one of them had been able to get within 20 feet of Thunder without triggering an explosive reaction. Yet here was this quiet veteran, this stranger who had arrived just hours ago, standing at the fence while the killer stallion voluntarily approached him. Some of them shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered prayers of gratitude. All of them understood they were witnessing something they would talk about for years to come. Thunder's internal struggle was visible in every line of his body. His ears swiveled back and forth, his weight shifted from hoof to hoof, his tail swished in agitation. Everything he had learned about survival told him to retreat, to re-establish distance, to never let a human close enough to cause harm. But something else was pulling at him, a deep need that even his trauma could not completely erase. Horses were herd animals, social creatures who craved connection and touch. Thunder had been isolated by his own fear for so long that the loneliness must have been excruciating, even if he could not name it as such. James represented a possibility that terrified and tempted him in equal measure. James continued speaking softly, his words a gentle current carrying Thunder toward a shore the horse could not quite see but could sense was there. "I'm not going anywhere, Thunder. You can take all the time you need. There's no rush, no pressure. We're just two broken souls standing under the stars, and that's enough for now. That's more than enough." James meant every word. He had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable, had discovered that healing happened on its own timeline and could not be forced or hurried. Whether Thunder needed 5 minutes or 5 months to learn to trust again, James was prepared to give him that time. The night air grew cooler still, and Marcus finally stepped off the porch with a jacket in hand, walking slowly toward the fence so as not to disturb the delicate dynamic between James and Thunder. He approached from the side, making his presence known without being intrusive, and held out the jacket to James with a questioning look. James accepted it with a nod of thanks, pulling it on with slow, careful movements that would not startle Thunder. The stallion watched this interaction intently, seeing how James and Marcus moved around each other with easy familiarity, how the exchange was peaceful and calm. It was another piece of information for Thunder to process, another small example that not all human interactions involve dominance or violence. After Marcus returned to the house, James shifted his position slightly, moving from standing to sitting on the top fence rail, his legs dangling on the inside of the corral. It was a calculated risk, putting himself partially inside Thunder's space, but James judged that the stallion was ready for this incremental increase in proximity. Thunder's head came up sharply at first, alert to the change, but when James simply sat there without advancing further, the horse relaxed again. They stayed like that for long minutes, man perched on the fence and horse standing in the shadowy corral, existing together in a bubble of tentative peace. James began to talk again, but this time he spoke about himself, sharing pieces of his own story with Thunder, as if the horse was a therapist who could absolve him of his guilt and pain. He talked about the day his convoy had been hit by an improvised explosive device, about the friends he had lost, about the way he had come home with all his limbs intact, but his mind shattered. He spoke about the nightmares that still came sometimes, about the way loud noises could send him diving for cover even years later, about the marriages that had failed because he could not let anyone close enough to see how damaged he really was. The words poured out of him like water from a cracked dam, things he had never said aloud to anyone, secrets he had kept locked away because he was ashamed of his weakness. Thunder listened, his ears tracking the rise and fall of James's voice, his dark eyes reflecting starlight as he watched the man on the fence. Perhaps the horse understood the content of James's confession, or perhaps he simply recognized the sound of shared suffering, the timbre of a voice speaking truth about pain. Whatever Thunder comprehended, he moved closer again, drawn by the vulnerability in James's words. The stallion came to stand directly in front of where James sat, close enough now that James could have reached out and touched him without stretching, but he did not. He kept his hands resting on his own knees, kept his body language open and non-threatening, and continued talking. The hours passed in that strange communion between man and horse, time losing its usual meaning under the vast canopy of stars. James talked until his voice grew hoarse, sharing memories he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed. He spoke of his childhood on his uncle's ranch, of the first horse he had ever ridden, a gentle mare named Bess, who had carried him through summer afternoons with infinite patience. He talked about his father, a man who had taught him that strength meant protecting those weaker than yourself, not dominating them. He spoke of the moment he had decided to enlist, full of patriotic fervor and youthful certainty that he was going to make a difference in the world, and how that certainty had been stripped away by the reality of combat. Thunder stood motionless throughout this monologue, his breathing synchronized with James's, his presence a solid anchor in the darkness. The stallion's earlier trembling had subsided, replaced by a watchful stillness that felt different from the vigilant tension of before. This was the stillness of attention, of listening, of a mind engaged rather than a body prepared for flight or fight. James could feel the shift in the air between them, something subtle but profound changing in the way Thunder held himself. The horse was still afraid, still damaged, still carrying whatever trauma had made him so dangerous. But for this moment at least, he was choosing to be present rather than reactive. As midnight approached, James finally fell silent, his words exhausted, his emotional reserves depleted by the catharsis of confession. He sat on the fence rail feeling oddly lighter, as if sharing his pain with this damaged horse had somehow reduced its weight. Thunder remained standing before him, and in the quiet that followed James's storytelling, the stallion took another step forward. Now he was close enough that James could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the earthy scent of horse sweat and hay. Thunder lowered his head slowly, deliberately, until his muzzle was level with James's chest, and then he did something that brought tears to the veteran's eyes. The horse gently pressed his forehead against James's heart and held it there. It was a gesture of trust so complete, so vulnerable, that James felt his breath catch in his throat. In horse language, this kind of contact was profound. Thunder was not just tolerating James's presence. He was seeking comfort from him, acknowledging connection, asking for the kind of reassurance that only another living being could provide. James raised his hands very slowly, giving Thunder every opportunity to pull away, and when the horse did not retreat, he placed his palms on either side of Thunder's face, cradling that massive head with a gentleness that belied his scarred, calloused hands. "There you are," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "There you are, boy. I see you now." They stayed frozen in that tableau for what felt like an eternity. Man and horse breathing together, hearts beating in rhythm, two survivors finding solace in each other's brokenness. James felt something inside him shift and settle, a piece of his own fractured soul clicking into place. He had thought he was here to heal Thunder, but he was beginning to realize that the healing would flow both directions. This horse needed him, yes, but he needed Thunder just as much. In saving the stallion, he might finally save himself. Eventually, James knew he would have to move, would have to break this perfect moment and return to the practical world of ranches and daylight and decisions about Thunder's future. But not yet. For now, he simply held Thunder's head and let the tears he had been holding back for years finally fall, dampening the white coat beneath his hands. Thunder did not pull away from those tears. Instead, he leaned in closer, as if he understood that James's tears were not weakness, but release. Not ending, but beginning. The horse had his own tears to shed, his own trauma to release, and perhaps in this shared vulnerability they could both find a path forward. Sarah had gone to bed hours ago, but Marcus remained on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, bearing witness to the miracle unfolding in his corral. He had owned horses all his life, had seen countless examples of the bonds between humans and animals, but this was different. This was two souls recognizing each other across the vast divide that was supposed to separate species, reaching through their individual darkness to find light in each other. Marcus felt privileged to watch it happen, even from a distance, even without fully understanding what he was seeing. He knew that by morning, Thunder would still be traumatized and dangerous, that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that something fundamental had shifted tonight. Thunder had chosen connection over isolation, had taken the first terrifying step toward trust. When James finally released Thunder's head and climbed down from the fence, his muscles stiff from sitting motionless for so long, the stallion followed him along the fence line, walking parallel to James as he made his way toward the gate. It was not quite following, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Thunder was saying he saw James too, that he recognized what had passed between them, that maybe, just maybe, he was willing to see where this strange new relationship might lead. The days that followed that first breakthrough were a testament to patience and persistence. James arrived at Meadowbrook Ranch each morning before sunrise, his truck rattling down the long driveway, while the world was still cloaked in darkness. He would park in the same spot, walk the same path to Thunder's corral, and sit in the same chair that had become his post. Thunder began waiting for him, standing near the fence where they had made their connection, nickering softly when he heard James's footsteps approaching. It was a sound that made every ranch hand stop and stare, because Thunder had never made welcoming sounds for anyone before. Progress was not linear. There were good days when Thunder would approach within minutes, would stand calmly while James talked to him, would even allow brief touches to his neck and shoulder. Then there were difficult days when something would trigger the stallion's trauma, and he would retreat to the far corner of the corral, shaking and wild-eyed, unreachable despite James's gentle calls. On those days, James simply sat and waited, sometimes for hours, until Thunder felt safe enough to emerge from whatever dark memory had claimed him. James never showed frustration or disappointment. He understood that healing was messy, that the mind did not recover in straight lines but in spirals and loops, circling back to touch old wounds before moving forward again. Marcus watched this process with growing respect for James's methods. The veteran had explained that he was not training Thunder in the traditional sense, not teaching him commands or breaking his spirit to accept human authority. Instead, James was helping Thunder learn that he could make choices, that he had agency in his interactions with humans, that no was an acceptable answer and would be respected. This was revolutionary thinking for many of the ranch hands who had been raised on the old ways of horsebreaking, but they could not argue with the results. Thunder was changing slowly but unmistakably from a dangerous animal that no one could approach to a horse who was beginning to trust again. Sarah documented everything with meticulous notes and photographs, creating a record of Thunder's transformation that she hoped might help other traumatized horses in the future. She captured images of James sitting quietly while Thunder paced, of the first time Thunder ate from James's hand, of the morning when the stallion allowed James to slip a soft rope halter over his head without resistance. Each photograph told part of the story, but Sarah knew that the most important elements could not be captured on film. The bond between James and Thunder existed in the space between moments, in the silent understanding that flowed between them, in the way they seemed to breathe in synchrony when they were together. 3 weeks into their work, James reached a critical milestone. He entered Thunder's corral for the first time. The ranch hands gathered to watch, some fearful that this would be the moment when Thunder's fragile progress shattered and the violence returned. Marcus stood ready with a phone in hand, prepared to call emergency services if needed. But James moved with such calm certainty, such respect for Thunder's space and boundaries, that the stallion simply watched him come. James walked to the center of the corral and stopped, his body language relaxed, his hands visible and empty. He waited. Thunder circled him slowly, keeping distance at first, his nostrils flaring as he processed this change in their dynamic. For 5 full minutes they moved in a slow dance, Thunder circling and James turning to keep the horse in his peripheral vision without staring. Then Thunder stopped circling and walked directly toward James, closing the distance until they stood face to face, breath mingling in the cool morning air. James raised one hand and placed it on Thunder's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the white coat, feeling the heartbeat that thundered in the stallion's chest. "Good boy," James whispered. "You're so brave, Thunder. So incredibly brave." From that day forward, James worked with Thunder inside the corral regularly, building on their foundation of trust to introduce new experiences carefully and gradually. He taught Thunder that being led by a rope did not mean being dragged or forced, that pressure on the halter was a request for cooperation rather than a demand for submission. He showed Thunder that grooming could be pleasurable, that human hands could bring relief to itchy spots and comfort to tense muscles. Each lesson was broken into tiny increments, respecting Thunder's need to process and consent to every new experience before moving forward. Some tasks that would take an hour with a normal horse took 3 days with Thunder, but James never rushed. The transformation began to accelerate as Thunder's confidence grew. The stallion, who had been locked in survival mode for so long, started to relax into something resembling normalcy. He began eating better, his coat developing a healthy shine that had been absent when he arrived. His eyes lost some of their haunted quality, replaced by curiosity. and even playfulness. James introduced Thunder to the other horses gradually, supervised meetings over the fence where Thunder could interact socially without feeling trapped or threatened. The stallion was tentative at first, but eventually he began to engage, touching noses with a gentle mare named Daisy, accepting the presence of an older gelding named Buck who seemed to understand that Thunder needed patience. Marcus started to believe that Thunder might actually have a future beyond this ranch, that with enough time and James's continued guidance, the stallion could become a riding horse again, could find a purpose and a home where his past would not define him. 2 months after that first encounter, the day came that everyone had been both hoping for and dreading. James arrived at the ranch with a saddle in his truck bed, the leather worn smooth from years of use, but still strong and serviceable. He had discussed this step with Thunder in the way they now communicated, through body language and intuition, through the deep connection they had forged in those long hours together. James believed Thunder was ready, but he also knew that this would be the ultimate test of everything they had built together. Allowing a human on his back would require Thunder to surrender control in a way that might trigger every defense mechanism the stallion had developed to survive. The ranch staff gathered again, unable to stay away despite having morning chores that demanded their attention. Sarah stood with her camera, but her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. Marcus leaned against the fence, his jaw tight with tension, hoping this would not be the moment when everything fell apart. James felt the weight of their expectations and their fears, but he pushed those external pressures aside and focused solely on Thunder. The horse stood in the center of the corral, watching James approach with the saddle, his ears forward with interest rather than pinned back in fear. That was promising, but James knew the real challenge would come when the weight settled on Thunder's back, when the cinch tightened around his barrel, when the memories of whatever had happened before came flooding back. James moved through the saddling process with ritual slowness, narrating each step in his soft voice so Thunder knew what to expect. He let Thunder smell the saddle pad, investigate the stirrups with his nose, watch as James lifted the saddle into position. When the weight settled onto Thunder's back, the stallion tensed, his muscles turning to stone beneath his hide. James kept one hand on Thunder's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat, the trembling that started in the horse's core. He did not rush to cinch the saddle. Instead, he simply stood there, his presence steady and calm, reminding Thunder that he was safe, that James would never hurt him, that this was a choice they were making together. Long minutes passed while Thunder processed the sensation of the saddle, working through whatever associations it triggered. James talked to him constantly, telling him how proud he was of Thunder's courage, how far they had come together, how this was not an ending, but a new beginning. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Thunder's trembling subsided. His breathing slowed and deepened. The tension in his muscles eased. When James finally tightened the cinch, Thunder flinched but did not explode. He stood his ground, trusting James enough to override his instinct to panic. It was a victory more significant than any trophy, more valuable than any ribbon. James left the saddle on Thunder for 20 minutes that first day, just letting the horse grow accustomed to the weight and feel of it while they walked together around the corral. He did not attempt to mount. That would come later, perhaps days or weeks from now, when Thunder was completely comfortable with this stage. For now, it was enough that Thunder had accepted the saddle without violence, had trusted James enough to endure something that clearly brought up difficult memories. When James removed the tack at the end of the session, Thunder leaned into him with a sigh that seemed to release years of held tension. James wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck and held him close, both of them breathing together, both of them knowing they had crossed a threshold. The following weeks brought steady progress. Thunder learned to carry the saddle with ease, then to accept James's weight as the veteran leaned across his back before eventually swinging a leg over and sitting astride. The first time James sat fully in the saddle, his feet in the stirrups, his hands gentle on the reins, Thunder stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats before taking his first tentative step. James felt tears streaming down his face as they walked those first few steps together, man and horse moving as one unit, trust made manifest in motion. Around the corral they went slowly and carefully, while the ranch hands cheered and Sarah openly wept behind her camera. Marcus approached James after that momentous ride, his weathered face split by a grin wider than any James had seen from the ranch owner. He offered to buy Thunder to keep him at Meadowbrook Ranch permanently, where he could continue working with James, but James shook his head gently. Thunder was not for sale, he explained, because Thunder was coming home with him. James had already built an addition to his small stable, had prepared everything Thunder would need, had made space in his life and his heart for this horse, who had given him back something precious he thought he had lost forever. Thunder had shown James that healing was possible, that connection could survive trauma, that broken pieces could be put back together into something even stronger than before. On the day James loaded Thunder into his trailer for the drive to his cabin, the stallion walked up the ramp without hesitation, trusting James to take him somewhere safe. As they drove away from Meadowbrook Ranch, James looked in his rearview mirror and saw Thunder's white face watching him through the trailer window, calm and confident. The giant horse who had attacked everyone who came near, who had been considered dangerous and unsalvageable, had found his voice in the presence of a veteran who understood that sometimes the loudest cries for help sound like anger. Together, they had proven that with patience, understanding, and the willingness to see past the surface to the wounded soul beneath, even the most damaged spirits could learn to trust again, to heal, to find peace in a world that had once seemed determined to destroy them. Their journey was not ending, it was just beginning.